Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing well. Today I'm going to record the first video starting with the basics. Understanding the basics is the most important thing in the Malaysian SNR strategy. If you don't know how to choose the right levels, the rest won't work. And you will keep losing because all your setups is in the wrong place. But by mastering the basics, you just need to apply the setups that we will learn later. Okay? Just I will use a simple language and I apologize if I make any mistakes. I will try to give you all the knowledge that I can. Okay, so let's get started with the basics. In the basics, we have SNR levels, we have fresh and unfresh levels, and lastly, powerful levels. For the SNR levels and unfresh levels are something simple. You can check my PDF if you are confused. Okay, I chose not to explain them because all of you understand them. Okay, so let's move to the powerful level. So, powerful level are something special you can trade based on. They are levels that align across multiple time frame. Okay, and are a strong levels. Okay, uh, when the price reaches them, they will always give us a reaction. Okay, so which time frame do we use? We use the weekly and daily and the 4 hour levels. Okay, rules. Weekly and daily need to be fresh. Okay, and for the 4 hour level does not need to be fresh level. Okay, and how we do enter from these powerful levels? We enter from them by a limit order using a sell limit order or a buy limit order dependent of the level. Okay, if we are in on the V-shape level or A-shape level, okay, we use 13 pips stop loss, why 1 to 5 risk to reward take profit. Or the second type of entry is by using the 1 minute break trend line confirmation. So what is the confirmation? We have say confirmation when the price reaches these levels, these powerful levels, and we see the break of the 1 minute trend line, you just enter from them directly. Okay, we said use 13 pips like SL and 1 to 5 risk to reward. The same with the buy setups. When the price reaches these powerful levels and we see our break 1 minute trend line, we enter directly from there by using 13 pips SL and 1 to 5 risk to reward. Okay, so let's see some examples on the chart. So what is this? This is an A shape fresh weekly. Okay, this is a fresh level on the weekly time frame. Okay, so let's do one time frame lower, which is the daily time frame. Okay, what do we see on the daily time frame? We see the daily align with the weekly levels on this V-shape level. Okay, and so let's drop one time frame lower, which is the 4 hour time frame. Okay. In the 4 hour time frame, we see the 4 hour time frame is aligned with the daily and the weekly in this bullish gap and on this bearish gap. Okay, for the 4 hour time frame, we need at least one level aligned with the weekly and the daily, and it doesn't need to be fresh. Okay, but for this is our zone. So for the daily, it's a fresh level, okay? And for the weekly, it's also a fresh level, okay? So the next candle have touched our powerful level here, okay? So let's go to the 4-hour time frame. Our level have touched here, so we said, sorry, so we said we enter directly from there by using 13 pips SL and 1 to 5 risk to reward. This is 13 pips SL and this is 1 to 5 risk to reward. Okay, there is a lot of examples when the weekly and the daily and the 4-hour align with each other. So let's see another example. Here, what is this? This is a fresh weekly level, right? This is fresh weekly level. Let's put our vertical line on the next candle that have touched our level, our powerful level. So after we mark the weekly level, we need to drop one time frame lower, which is the daily time frame. We see the daily time frame is aligned with the weekly. Yes, what is this? Yeah, I take it before, so I didn't see it. So we see our weekly time frame align with the daily time frame in this V-shaped level on the daily, okay? And the daily are fresh level, okay? Because our level have touched, our daily level are fresh here, and the weekly level has touched here, okay? So we enter, let's check the 4-hour time frame. In the 4-hour time frame, we said we need at least one level, aligned with the weekly and the daily. We see the A shape, this level and this level are aligned with the weekly and the daily. And it doesn't matter if it's fresh or not. Okay, so we said we enter from our level directly by using a 13 pips SL and 1 to 5 risk to reward. Okay, so let's see another example. Let's see another example. This example right here. What is this? This is a fresh weekly V-shape level. Okay, and it's a fresh level. Okay, so let's drop one time frame lower, which is the daily time frame. We see the daily time frame are aligned with the weekly level in this V-shape level. Okay, and it's fresh. Okay, so let's drop another time frame, which is the 4-hour time frame, the last time frame. Okay, in the 4-hour time frame, we see the 4-hour time frame aligned with the daily and the weekly time frame on this V-shape level. Okay, it's aligned with each other. Okay, and it doesn't need to be fresh or unfresh level. Okay, so we said we enter directly from there by a limit order using 13 pips SL. Okay, 13 pips SL and 1 to 5 risk to reward. Okay, guys, these setups, it's always up here when the weekly and the daily and the 4-hour time frame and levels are aligned with each other. Okay, so we saw these 3 examples. For the homework, I will send you the homework that allow you to master these simple setups by backtesting on the past and for the past levels. Okay, there is a lot of examples here, a lot of examples here. There is a setup here. Okay, there is a setup here. There is also uh, a setup here. Okay, there is a setup here. There is another setup here. There is another setup here. Okay, so when you see the weekly and for the weekly, we need the level to be A shape or V shape only. Okay, don't use the gap level on the weekly, just the V and the A shape. Okay, but for the daily and the weekly, it doesn't matter the type of the level that we have aligned with the weekly. Okay, so this is our session about the powerful level. In the next sessions, we will learn the breakouts and how we can use it to identify the storyline. Okay, I will send you the homework later, so see you in the next videos.